Hi there, I'm just a little cat trying to reach my first 1,000 subscribers. It's free. Just click subscribe right under this video. It would mean the world to me.
I hadn't been home in over 6 years. Not since the last time my mother told me, without blinking, that I brought shame to the Miller name by divorcing my husband and folding my business in the same godforsaken year. That time, she stood on the porch with her arms crossed so tight I could see her knuckles go white. And she said, "Caroline, you may have come from this family, but you sure as hell didn't inherit any of our spine." And then she turned and went inside, just like that. No goodbye, no hug. So when I stepped through the front door for my father's funeral, I wasn't just walking into the house I grew up in. I was walking into the belly of every resentment I had spent my adult life trying to swallow whole. Everything smelled exactly the same. That faint hint of lemon polish mixed with old books and a kind of stale tension that settled in your lungs like dust. Mark, my brother, gave me a half-hearted nod from the corner of the living room, already 2 drinks deep with his shirt unbuttoned just enough to remind everyone he didn't have to try too hard. He was always like that, coasting on charm, tripping over good luck, catching praise like it was his birthright. Meanwhile, I learned to stitch myself back together quietly every time life or family took a swipe. The funeral was tasteful, of course. Evelyn wouldn't have allowed anything less. Her veil was dramatic, her eulogy coldly precise, her grief curated like it was being judged. She cried on cue, just enough tears to elicit sympathy, but never enough to smudge her lipstick. She spoke about my father like he was a business partner rather than a husband. I stood beside her, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, pretending I didn't notice the way she skipped my name entirely when listing off those closest to Walter. That evening, she insisted on a family dinner, as if death was just another opportunity to prove how functional we were. She had the long table set in the formal dining room, candles lit, wine poured, her favorite china out, like the queen of some crumbling dynasty trying to hold on to ceremony while the walls collapsed around her. I wore black. Not because I was in mourning, but because it felt appropriate to dress like I was attending the final scene of a very old, very bitter play. The conversation was stiff at first. Mark filled the space with easy chatter, deflecting questions about his job with vague smiles and empty words. Evelyn kept her gaze on him like he was the only character in the story worth directing. When she finally turned her attention to me, it wasn't to ask how I was, or if I needed anything, or if maybe, just maybe, she had misunderstood me all those years ago, no. Instead, she tilted her wine glass toward me and said, "I'm surprised you made it. After all, your father was the only one who ever had any patience for your missteps." I didn't react, I just let her dig. She sipped her wine, eyes sharp and cold. "Now that he's gone, it's time we talk like adults. About the estate." I said nothing, I waited. Evelyn pressed on, her tone cutting through the candlelight like broken glass. "It goes without saying that your brother will be handling the major assets. The house, the shares, the accounts. You've always been distant, detached. And frankly, you've never earned your place in this family. That's not me being cruel. That's just the truth." There it was. The dagger she'd been holding since I arrived. Mark, to his credit, at least had the decency to shift uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't speak. He never did when it mattered. He let her talk like she was the voice of reason, the sole keeper of legacy and logic. And I think that's what made my next move so satisfying. How quiet the room got when I reached into my bag, pulled out a thick manila folder, and gently slid it across the table toward her. She looked at it like I had just placed a dead rat on her plate. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, her voice sharp but uncertain. "Proof," I said calmly. "Proof that maybe Dad didn't see things the way you think he did." Her fingers trembled just slightly as she opened the folder. Inside were copies of property deeds, share transfers, bank authorizations, all signed by my father over the course of the last 3 years. Bit by bit, he'd given me ownership of nearly everything. He had done it quietly, behind closed doors, because he knew my mother would have never allowed it while she still had control over the narrative. I watched her face change as she flipped through the pages. First confusion, then disbelief, and finally something like panic. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she reached for her wine glass with a shaky hand and dropped it. It shattered against the hardwood, red liquid pooling like blood across the white tablecloth. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just said, "Dad didn't think inheritance had to be earned. He thought it had to be protected." She stood up so fast her chair scraped violently against the floor. "This is a lie," she hissed. "No," I said, steady. "It's the truth you never wanted to see." And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I watched my mother's mask slip. Just for a second. Underneath all the steel and spite was something hollow, something scared. I stood up too slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate, controlled. "We'll talk more later," I said, gathering my things. "There's more, much more." And as I walked away from the table, leaving behind the shards of broken glass and the silence that followed, I didn't look back, because I knew the game had only just begun. It's a strange thing, realizing that your entire childhood was orchestrated like a play written by someone who never wanted you in the lead role. I used to think that maybe, if I was quieter, smarter, more agreeable, or less opinionated, I'd earn my way into the narrative. But no matter what I did, whether I brought home awards or folded laundry without being asked, it always seemed like the spotlight belonged elsewhere, and it stayed fixed on Mark, whose every misstep was seen as a charming stumble rather than a flaw worth correcting. Looking back now, I can say with certainty that my father saw it too, but unlike my mother, who wore her favoritism like expensive perfume, impossible to ignore and suffocating in close quarters, my father tried to counterbalance her in quiet, often clumsy ways. He wasn't the type to stand between Evelyn and a target, but he would sneak me a smile when she wasn't looking, or leave a book on my nightstand with a note that simply said, "You'll like this one." That was how he said he saw me. In silent, gentle acknowledgments that I mattered, even if no one else acted like I did. After college, I did everything they told me I was supposed to do. I married the right kind of man, hosted the right kind of dinner parties, smiled through the right kind of pain. My husband, David, was the sort of man Evelyn adored. Handsome, financially predictable, and as emotionally empty as a decorative bowl. He and I made it 5 years before the foundation cracked. I remember the night I told her we were separating. She sipped her tea and said, "Well, he always did deserve better." It didn't matter why I left or how long I'd been unhappy. What mattered to her was that my exit wasn't neat, and therefore it was an embarrassment. When the business failed 6 months later, the silence from home was deafening. Not a single call, not a word from Mark. Evelyn didn't even pretend to ask what went wrong. It was like my failure had confirmed everything she already believed about me, that I was, as she once phrased it during a Thanksgiving argument, one of those women who confuse ambition with capability. But then something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. My father, who had mostly been a background figure by that point, retired, often silent, drifting further into a kind of detached fog, called me one day out of the blue. He asked if I could come to the lake house for a weekend, just the two of us. No agenda, he said. Just a visit. I was suspicious at first, but something in his voice pulled at me, so I drove out there on a Friday afternoon, unsure of what I'd find. The lake house had always been his place, a quiet sanctuary far from Evelyn's reach, a space where he could play the role of husband without constantly being corrected. That weekend, he cooked dinner with me, slow and patient like we had all the time in the world. We sat on the porch with glasses of bourbon, talking about old music and books we never got around to reading. And then on Saturday night, as we watched the sun dip into the water, he cleared his throat and said, "Caroline, I'm not going to be around forever, and there are things I need to put right before I go." I didn't say anything, just waited. He continued, "Your brother has made a mess of more than he admits. He's leveraged the estate in ways I never signed off on, and your mother, well, she's always had a blind spot where he's concerned. I should have stepped in earlier, but I didn't. And that's on me, but I can make sure the future is a little less lopsided." Over the next year and a half, piece by piece, He started transferring assets into my name. Shares in his investment firm, the deed to a rental property in Savannah, a portfolio of municipal bonds he had hidden from even Evelyn. He insisted we keep it quiet. She'll contest it if she knows. She'll spin it into something ugly. This way there's no argument, just paper and law. At first I resisted. It felt wrong, underhanded, like I was stealing something that didn't belong to me. But he looked at me with such clarity, such deliberate intention, and said, "You didn't ask for this, Caroline, but you earned it more than anyone else ever will." Those words settled in my chest like hot coal. During one of our last weekends together, he handed me a leather folder with everything organized. Documents, notarizations, a letter addressed to me in his handwriting. He said, "If anything happens to me, you take this and you don't let them rewrite the story. They'll try, but you hold your ground." I didn't know then how soon I'd need it. He was gone less than a year later, heart failure, quick and cruel. Evelyn didn't cry at the hospital. Mark didn't even make it in time. I sat with his body for over an hour before anyone else arrived, clutching that folder like it was the last real thing, tethering me to someone who had actually seen me for who I was. And now here I was, back at the house that had never felt like mine, watching my mother measure out my worth with condescension and half-sipped wine, completely unaware that I already owned more of her empire than she ever would again. It should have made me feel powerful, but all I felt was tired of being erased, tired of pretending I didn't notice, tired of carrying the truth like a secret I wasn't allowed to share. But I wouldn't be quiet much longer, because secrets, especially the kind wrapped in legal documentation and sealed with a dying man's trust, don't stay buried forever. And as for Mark, the golden son who could do no wrong, well, I had a meeting with a lawyer the next morning, and something told me he wasn't going to like what was already in motion. There's something profoundly disorienting about sitting across from someone who believes, with unwavering certainty, that they still control the game, even as the rules have already been rewritten behind their back. My mother had always operated from a place of absolute authority. Her words were law, her judgments final, and the family, broken as it was, spun on the fragile axis of her perception. And yet here she was, making plans to liquidate property, shift assets, and wrap her bony fingers tighter around an inheritance she assumed was hers to orchestrate, blissfully unaware that every move she made was based on outdated power she no longer possessed. The morning after the dinner, the one where her wine glass had shattered like the illusion she lived in, I received a call from the family lawyer, Arthur Klein, a man who had served my father for nearly 30 years, and who had always treated me with a kind of restrained kindness, as though he saw more than he let on. He spoke in clipped, cautious tones, asking me to come by the office alone. "There are matters your mother doesn't know about," he said, "and your father was very specific about how and when they'd be discussed." His voice carried the weight of something unfinished, and I could feel, even through the phone, that this wasn't a conversation he intended to have with just anyone. The office hadn't changed in 2 decades, still covered in dark wood, still filled with that scent of old leather and stale coffee, the kind of place where deals are made in low voices and handshakes still mean something. Arthur met me at the door himself, gesturing for me to follow him down a narrow hallway and into a private conference room. There, laid out on the table, were the final documents my father had prepared, documents that went far beyond the folder I'd slid across the dinner table. What I learned in that room reframed everything I thought I understood about the man who raised me. Not only had he transferred ownership of his personal properties to me, quietly, systematically, and in perfect legal order, but he had also ensured that the shares in his firm, the offshore account I hadn't known existed, and a collection of unlisted assets, including a safe deposit box containing old bearer bonds, would be accessible by me and only me upon the confirmation of his death. There were letters, personal ones, stored with Arthur for safekeeping, along with an audio recording, my father's voice, faint and frail, but clear as ever, explaining his choices. "Caroline," he began, "if you're hearing this, then I'm gone, and there's no one left to mediate the inevitable fallout. I know this will make you a target. Evelyn will never forgive me for this, but she left me no choice. She never understood you. She never saw your worth, and I'm sorry for all the years I let that happen under my roof. But I want you to know that everything I've built, everything that mattered, is now yours. Not because you begged for it or manipulated your way into it, but because you are the only one I trust not to destroy it. I sat there long after the tape ended, the silence heavy and strange, a mix of validation and grief pressing against my ribs like a weight I couldn't adjust. I had always known my father loved me in his own quiet way, but this was beyond love. This was belief. And belief, in a family like mine, was the rarest currency of all. Arthur handed me a key, simple, gold, and unmarked, and said, "He wanted you to have this last. It's to the safe deposit box. No one else knows about it. I suggest you keep it that way." There was no ceremony, no further explanation, just that. A key and a nod, and the understanding that from this point forward, I wasn't reacting to the family's moves. I was dictating the pace. Back at the house, Evelyn was on the phone when I walked in, her voice sharp and performative, most likely speaking to one of her charity board friends about the tremendous loss she was enduring. She didn't even acknowledge me at first, just waved a hand in the air like I was background noise. But I watched her closely as I moved through the kitchen, watched the way her fingers tightened on the stem of her wine glass, how her voice rose slightly when I opened a drawer and began pulling out old papers she thought I didn't know existed. She knew something had shifted. She just didn't know what. The next night, she called for another dinner, this one smaller, just the three of us, Evelyn, Mark, and me. She wore the same pearls she'd worn to my father's funeral, a choice I found both symbolic and distastefully theatrical. The table was set again, candlelight flickering over polished silver, and for a moment, it felt like déjà vu, the same choreography, the same veiled hostility. But this time, the balance was different. This time, I wasn't the one shrinking in the shadow. She started the conversation with a statement, not a question. "I've spoken with the firm. They've confirmed that Mark will be assuming Walter's seat on the board and will be liquidating the lake property for reinvestment. I trust you'll be reasonable and sign the agreement tomorrow." I didn't respond immediately. I just reached into my bag, pulled out another folder, this one thicker than the last, and placed it carefully on the table in front of her. No words, no drama, just paper. Mark looked confused. Evelyn cautious. She opened the folder, scanning the first few pages, and I could see the color begin to drain from her face as realization set in. Not only was the lake house already under my name, but the firm shares, long assumed to be passing to Mark, were fully transferred to me 6 months prior to my father's death. Her plans weren't just premature. They were legally impossible. This can't be real," she whispered, flipping pages with growing desperation. "It's real," I said finally, "and legally binding. Dad made sure of that." Mark leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Why would he give everything to you? You barely even—" "Because he knew I wouldn't burn it to the ground," I cut in, my voice calm but unyielding. "He knew I'd protect it, not drain it for status or ego." Evelyn rose from her chair so suddenly that the candles flickered. Her face twisted with a fury I hadn't seen since I was a child. "You stole this. You manipulated him when he was weak." "No," I said, standing now as well. "I was the only one who stayed. While you were busy preserving your image and Mark was spending money he didn't have, I was the one making sure Dad didn't die, wondering if he'd failed as a father." Her hand trembled over the folder. For once, she had nothing to say. And in that silence, I felt the shift become complete. I wasn't just part of the story now. I was writing it. It's a curious thing, the way some people, when they lose power, don't go silent or shrink with humility, but instead begin to writhe and claw like an animal cornered, desperate, snarling, unwilling to accept that their kingdom, built on illusion and intimidation, was never really theirs to begin with. And that was exactly what I saw in my mother's eyes in the days that followed the second dinner, the one where I placed her fantasies of control onto the table like a surgeon revealing a tumor too large to ignore. Gone was the composed matriarch in pearls and stiff smiles, replaced instead by a woman scrambling to reclaim her image of authority while the foundation cracked beneath her heels. She began calling lawyers, family friends, legacy names, the type who wear pinstripe suits and treat the law like a country club rulebook that only applied to those outside their circle. She tried to argue the documents, questioned the timeline, claimed mental incapacity on my father's part, and even hinted, in a moment of particularly deluded rage, that I might have coerced him somehow. But the paperwork was airtight, the transfers done with care and precision, and the dates lined up too perfectly with his recorded medical history and legal statements for anyone to dispute it with a straight face. Every effort she made fell flat, and as each door closed behind her, I watched her unravel thread by thread, the fabric of her identity no longer held together by the illusion that she was in charge. Mark, for his part, became uncharacteristically quiet after the confrontation. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't even show up at the house for 3 straight days, which would have been alarming if I hadn't already begun to suspect that his silence wasn't born from guilt or introspection, but rather from the realization that his entire charade was on the brink of public collapse. I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the way he avoided eye contact, in the sudden absence of his usual arrogance, and in the fact that, according to Arthur, he'd made 2 separate attempts to access firm accounts that no longer recognized his credentials. When he finally did reach out, it was through a terse, almost clinical message. "Let's talk. Just us." He didn't ask, he didn't apologize. He demanded, as though we were still operating in the fantasy, where his name carried the weight of truth. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to hear, firsthand, how far the golden sun had fallen from grace. We met at a bar in Midtown, a place he used to take clients when he still had enough money and ego to pretend that he was important. He looked tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in weeks, his shirt wrinkled, his tie loose, and for the first time in my life, I saw him not as the man who was handed everything I had to fight for, but as someone rapidly losing the only currency he ever truly possessed: perception. He got straight to it, skipping pleasantries like they were beneath him. "I know you think you've won," he said, swirling his drink without taking a sip, "but you don't understand what you've started. You've turned this family into a battlefield over scraps." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was so grotesquely disconnected from reality that I couldn't help myself. "Scraps?" I asked, leaning forward. "You mean the millions you leveraged to buy that condo you never lived in? The properties you mortgaged to cover your gambling debts? Or maybe you mean the firm you nearly drove into the ground with your half-baked investments?" He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Obebaitun," I said, pulling a small envelope from my bag and placing it on the table between us. "These are copies of the financial statements Dad asked Arthur to keep. Detailed, annotated, every cent you took, every lie you told. You weren't just careless, you were drowning. And instead of asking for help, you grabbed whatever you could on the way down, even if it wasn't yours to take." He didn't touch the envelope. He didn't even look at it. Instead, he muttered something about legacy, about how our name meant something once, and how he didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal in his own family. And in that moment, I realized that Mark still believed, despite the wreckage, despite the evidence, despite the truth slapping him in the face, that being the firstborn gave him a kind of divine immunity. But it didn't, not anymore. Back at the house, Evelyn was waiting for me in the sunroom, perched like a queen awaiting news from the battlefield. When I walked in, she stood expecting, hoping for some kind of capitulation, some softening, some remnant of the daughter she could still manipulate. But what she got instead was a letter, folded neatly and placed on the table between us, just like the others. "What's this now?" she asked, the edge in her voice sharp and defensive. "A notice of sale," I said calmly. "I've listed the lake house." Her face twisted, eyes widening in disbelief. "That house is a part of this family. It was where your father proposed to me, where Mark learned to swim. It's history, Caroline. No, I said, slowly, deliberately. It's property, and it's mine. You spent years teaching me that family doesn't guarantee kindness, that love comes with strings and silence. So I'm cutting the cord. Her voice rose then, shrill and furious. You're tearing this family apart. No, I replied, taking one last look around the room that once felt like a prison of expectations. It was already broken. I'm just done pretending we can tape it back together. She didn't follow me when I left. She didn't beg or scream or throw anything. She just stood there, stunned, small, finally aware that she had underestimated the one person she thought she'd broken beyond repair. And as I walked out of that house, down the same steps I'd been dragged across so many times before by shame or guilt or obligation, I realized something that both scared and liberated me. Revenge doesn't always look like fury or fire. Sometimes it's just letting the past collapse under the weight of its own lies and walking away without a single glance back. Grief, I've learned, doesn't always arrive as a wave of sorrow or a heavy fog of loss. It can come quietly, almost politely, dressed in the illusion of peace, disguised as a kind of weightlessness that settles into your chest when you finally accept that something truly is over. That's what I felt in the weeks following the sale of the lake house. Not vindication, not triumph, not even guilt, but a strange, unshakable stillness, as if the war I had been fighting for decades had finally ended, not with fanfare or explosions, but with a single, irreversible decision that left no room for retreat. And as the dust settled and the silence deepened around what used to be my family's kingdom, I found myself staring at the aftermath, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet understanding that victory, when it comes at this kind of cost, leaves a scar even deeper than the wound. Evelyn did not speak to me again, at least not directly. Her messages came through the occasional forwarded legal email or the cold courtesy of Mark, who had retreated into some shell of half-functioning self-preservation. He'd moved out of the city, taken what remained of his dignity, and according to Arthur, started liquidating his own assets to pay off the private loans no one was supposed to know about. He sent me a single message after the lake house closed, and it was as hollow as it was short, a vague apology wrapped in an accusation, like a man still trying to write himself into a narrative that no longer required his presence. You could have handled this differently, Peo. He wrote, and maybe I could have, but I didn't. And that, more than anything, was the point. Evelyn, on the other hand, remained exactly who she had always been. Controlled, cold, unwilling to acknowledge defeat, even as it settled around her like a funeral veil. She stayed in the main house, clinging to the last visible pieces of her legacy, pretending that the world hadn't shifted beneath her, that her social circle still saw her as the pillar of class and family she had so carefully projected for decades. But the calls slowed, the invitations waned, and the money, the real kind, the kind that buys silence and reinvention, was no longer hers to wield. She had gambled on her son, bet against her daughter, and now found herself living in the ruins of her own design, too proud to ask for help and too bitter to admit she'd lost. And then came Christmas. It was always her favorite holiday, not because of the warmth or the tradition, but because it was an opportunity to perform. Every detail, from the placement of the silver to the selection of the wines, was orchestrated like a Broadway production, with her as the unchallenged lead. Even when my father was alive, she ruled over the holidays like a queen over her crumbling court, tolerating our presence only as long as it supported the illusion that we were a picture-perfect family framed in garland and gold. So this year, I sent the invitations myself. One to Evelyn, hand-delivered by Arthur, with a note in my handwriting. Christmas Eve dinner, my house, one night, no lawyers. And one to Mark, more of a formality than an olive branch, because I already knew he would show up, if only to confirm for himself that there were no more cards left for him to play. I cooked every dish myself, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because there was something strangely cathartic about preparing a meal. I had watched my mother delegate to caterers year after year, as if actual effort was beneath her. I set the table with unmatched plates, poured wine into thick, imperfect glasses, and lit candles that smelled nothing like wealth but everything like warmth. They both arrived on time, which surprised me. Evelyn walked in first, wearing a coat that looked like it had been bought for a very different kind of evening. Her posture as rigid as ever, her face unreadable. Mark followed, quiet, his eyes scanning the room like a man trying to find the exits before the show starts. I welcomed them both without ceremony, gestured toward the table, and waited for them to sit before I began. We ate in near silence at first, the kind that hums with old wounds and unspoken accusations. Every clink of a fork against a plate louder than it should have been. Mark made a few weak attempts at small talk, and Evelyn responded with clipped politeness, but I didn't join in. I let them squirm, let the quiet stretch, let the discomfort settle in like dust no one wanted to acknowledge. Then after the plates were cleared and the wine was halfway gone, I stood up, walked into the other room, and came back carrying a thin box wrapped in dark paper. I placed it on the table between them and said, "There's something else, one final decision I made." Evelyn didn't move. Mark frowned. I unwrapped the box myself, pulled out a single envelope, and slid it toward them. Half of the estate, everything not already assigned or liquidated, is being donated, in Dad's name, to the town scholarship fund, the Veterans Clinic, the art center. Places he cared about, places you both ignored. Evelyn's mouth opened, but no words came. Mark looked like he wanted to protest, but even he knew it would be useless. "You can't do that," she finally said. Her voice barely above a whisper, not because she didn't know the truth, but because saying it out loud would make it real. "I already did," I replied, sitting back down and lifting my glass. To Walter Miller, the only person in this family who knew that love means more than leverage. They stared at me, frozen, and in that moment, I saw the truth of them more clearly than I ever had before. Not as parents, not as family, but as people shaped by fear and entitlement. Unable to imagine a world where their influence didn't guarantee control. They had played their roles for so long they forgot who wrote the script. And then, without asking, I poured them each a final glass of wine. "A toast," I said, lifting mine again, not smiling. "To legacy, whatever that really means." They didn't clink their glasses. Evelyn barely touched hers. Mark drank his in one gulp, like a man drowning. After they left, I sat in the quiet for a long time. The candles burned low, the wine went warm. And somewhere deep in the corner of my chest, I felt the beginning of something I couldn't quite name. Not closure, not peace, but something close to understanding. I didn't know if what I'd done made me the villain or the survivor or something in between. I just knew that for the first time in my life, I hadn't waited for someone else to give me permission to exist. And that, I think, is what my father wanted all along.